Good evening. Welcome to St. Jerome's University and the St. Jerome's Lectures in Catholic Experience. My name is Scott Klein, and I am this year's co-director of the lecture series, along with Joanne Benham-Rennick. Joanne was with you for the past year while I was away on sabbatical, and I've returned back and am very happy to be here and joining you this evening. It's wonderful. Can you turn the sound up just a bit? There's some people in the back who are not able to hear it. It's wonderful to see so many of you back after last week's lecture. It was of high quality, obviously, or you wouldn't be here. We expect nothing other than that from Peter, and he certainly delivered. Before we get any further into this evening, I'm going to ask Dr. David Perrin, the president of St. Jerome's University. That's too loud. I have a cold, and I don't know whether that's the microphone or my head. But everything is ringing right now. Okay, test 1, 2, 3, 4. How's that? Is that okay? Great. So, as I was saying, I will invite Dr. David Perrin, president of St. Jerome's University, to the podium.
Thanks very much, Dr. Klein. What a pleasure it is again to welcome all of you here tonight to St. Jerome's University on behalf of our faculty and our staff, our students, and the Center for Catholic Experience, the Center for Responsible Citizenship. Again, I see so many familiar faces, and many of you here last week obviously had a rich and meaningful experience with Dr. Peter Erb, and thank you so very much for that excellent lecture, and here tonight to continue the reflection and bring us all a little bit more in step with some of the very, I would say, convoluted, complicated, but you bring them forward in simple ways, these questions that perhaps are on our minds in relationship to secularity or atheism or whatever categories we want to bring them forth in. I would be remiss, I think, this evening if I didn't at least take a moment to pause and have us all recollect these difficult days. Since Peter was with us last week, we have the horrific earthquake in Haiti. I know all of you are aware of that. As Christians, as Catholics, we hold in prayer all of the difficulties, the problems, the challenges, an entire country, and indeed a world at this time that is responding in so many different ways, in generosity, in outpouring of services and supplies, heartfelt responses from around the world. And I know the good people here tonight, whatever you can do in relationship to assisting that challenge, that problem, you will bring forth and do likewise. So we take a moment just to recollect, to be mindful of them and ask God's blessings, be with them, journey with them, and as we move forward, we're mindful that we too in our humanity are united as one. So welcome again, Peter, and thank you for being back with us.
Just a quick mention that Dr. Perrin didn't throw into his notes about Haiti. Dr. Perrin actually spent 2 years in Haiti, so it's, I think, a quite personal thing to him. He was teaching high school there from 1982 to 1984, so he has a sort of personal experience with the people of Haiti. I'll just leave it at that, but I think he said it well, that our hearts and prayers are with him this evening. To turn to tonight's lecture, I want to introduce Peter Erb again. For those of you who have not met Peter, this will come as news, but those of you who do know Peter, what I'm about to tell you is probably as old as Peter is himself. Peter is a graduate of Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies and the University of Toronto. Peter and his wife Betty make their home in Waterloo. From 1971 to 1984, Peter was a faculty member in the Department of English at Wilfrid Laurier University. In 1984, he became a faculty member in Laurier's Department of Religion and Culture, a position he held until 2008. He has recently retired as visiting professor of Catholic Studies through St. Dunstan's University at the University of Prince Edward Island. where he worked from 2004 to 2009. Peter continues to teach and direct students through Waterloo Lutheran Seminary and the Toronto School of Theology. Peter is the author and editor of some 15 books and numerous articles. As we discovered last week in his talk, Peter's scholarly expertise is expansive, from patristic and medieval spirituality to the Enlightenment, and even to Anglican-Catholic relations in the 19th century. And also, as we discovered, the 19th century is about as far as Peter wants to go. His major study, which has been years, if not decades in the making, is a 4-volume critical edition of the correspondence between Prime Minister William Gladstone and the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Henry Manning. This monumental work of scholarship is scheduled to be published by Oxford University Press in 2011. As we heard last week, Peter and Betty are the parents of 2 daughters, Catherine, who teaches classics at Upper Canada College, and Suzanne, a neuroscientist at the University of Toronto. Peter and Betty also have 2 granddaughters. I think we were introduced to at least one of them last week. It is indeed an honor for St. Jerome's University to be hosting Peter tonight as he leads us into part 2 of his latest project, Facing a Secular Age, Notes for the Modern Skeptic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Erb to the podium.
Oh, you haven't got a picture. Well, that's all right, because while you're trying to get the picture up, I'll make just a few comments. And let me just because I have a tendency to go too long, and my wife has warned me about the nature of these chairs that you're in. But I don't have one, so it won't bother me in the least. But let me just put on the chart here while we're trying to get the picture up. The sort of way in which I want to look at this tonight. Basically, I have about 4 topics. I have a little introduction, which I'll do first. And then I want to talk about 2 major things. There we are. Must be right. It's not my music, though. Oh, okay. I want to talk right away about 2 major things. Tonight, the topic is the old agnosticism and the new church. Last week was the old church and the new atheism. Now, in a moment, I'll take you through that again. But what I want to do, first of all, after my little intro, is look, first of all, at what I mean, not what we mean, there's no we in this at all, it's just me, what I mean by the old agnosticism, which I also associate with the really new atheism. And then I want to look at the new church. Now, all of you who were here last week will know that I think the new church began with John Henry Newman in the 19th century, who will be beatified this year. And we'll talk a little bit about him later. But I want to, first of all, take a look at the new church by giving you just a brief rundown of my view of Vatican II, and then to show you where Vatican II really began with Newman, move on with Newman to his view of faith and reason and how he sees the atheist problem and Christian apologetic today. Clear on that? Great. Now we'll go ahead and confuse all that really badly. Last week, for those of you who were here, and by the way, for a moment, I don't want to insult people here. I know that I'm not speaking to a whole group of, flickering twits. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but, you know, it's a great belief on Twitter that you can't say, that anything's worth saying you can say in 140 characters. Nonsense. You can't do that, but I'm going to reduce what I had said last week to almost 140 characters. I'm doing that sort of to catch up a little bit, but also for those people who may not have been here last week and want to know what on earth we were doing. And for those of you who were here last week and want to know what on earth I was doing, we'll do the same thing. Now, just a moment here. I've got a pointer somewhere. Got it, right here. This one is red, so I'm not the person at the game the other night. There. Now, I began last week by talking about about a major change in the world, a change that occurred around, I'm going to put it between 1509 and 1511. I'm going to do that because in a moment I'm going to show you a picture you saw last week. And my argument was last week that prior to roughly 1500, we're taking these dates in real general terms, prior to 1500, the world was enchanted. There was a sense in which nature, this area of thing, this area down here, led up into supernature, and supernature was already there, present with nature in all the terrors that nature has to experience, in this case, the death of humanity itself in all its fullness in Christ. Now, this is a Giotto picture. It was done in the early 1300s, and my argument was that what happened was that picture changed radically to this picture. This is a picture by Raphael. It was painted between 1509 and 1511, I think. I may be wrong on that. It's found in a room in the Vatican Palace called the Segnatura, and it shows a different picture of the world, a world in which nature, the world we live in down here, is totally cut off from supernature, the world up here. It's clouded between. You can have a hand pointing up, but all you can see are clouds. And in fact, a new God comes into being, or starts to come into being at this time, at least a new conception of God, a hierarchical conception of God, the Trinity, having moved from a concept of the Father expressing himself as love in his perfect image, the Son, and the Son turning that love, being the perfect image of God, is full love, turning that back on the Father, and the mutual love of the two being understood as the Holy Spirit. In other words, a dynamism of love and creative action, a pure act, Trinity, now becomes understood as a different Trinity, with the Father up here giving information to the Son, who passes it down to the Spirit, and you can somehow see all three of them here in the Eucharist. Now, you'll notice that the Eucharist, the monstrance there, and the Eucharist is central to the picture, even though it doesn't come off that well on this screen. You can see that it's central to the picture, and remember that as central to the picture because we're going to see one in a few minutes that's going to be slightly different. So my argument was that what happens somewhere around the beginning of the 1500s is we have a remarkable change in the world. Next week I'm going to look a little bit at what some of the other things that happened that brought this change into being. But for now, I simply want to move on to look at one aspect of this change. And I'm taking my watch out, although everyone who knows me knows it's a meaningless act. We'll turn to this picture here. This is last week's lecture in a nutshell. What I was arguing was that in the picture we saw, somewhere around 1500, shifts start to occur in the way in which people understand the world. There is a shift, there is a turn to nature alone with the rise of the inductive sciences, the ones we all know today. There is a turn to faith alone, and by the way, I mean no antagonism here to Protestants in this, to faith alone with the subjective formation of the self. We begin to turn interiorly and begin to think of ourselves. In other words, with that division we saw in the Raphael painting, we have only this world to think about. And so we think about the stuff out there with our scientific apparatuses, and we begin to think about me, myself, and we look inward in this apparatus that we are. And finally, on the world down here below, we start to see a separation. We see a turn to ordinary life as a socio-political reality. It's much different from the reality that was there before, when there was a representative of a king or an emperor even, who was over all of Europe, in which you could always be looking up as a representative that would look up to other things. In other words, that you would the transcendent and nature and supernature would somehow be linked together. And even the political life here on earth would be understood somewhere else. What happens now is the church gets applied to that stuff above the clouds, of which we know nothing at all about because it's behind the clouds, and the state gets applied to what's below, or the secular realm gets applied to what's below. And so we have a separation of church and state, the separation of the religious element in society from the secular. Now, my suggestion last week was that this brings into being old atheisms, which I say are falsely called new atheisms. The old atheisms frame truth by rationality alone, alongside the new inductive sciences, or they frame truth by myth, alongside the new subjectivism. This rationality alone I tried to explain in some detail. And then they frame truth as ordinary life alongside the new sovereign nation. I can't speak in this series about the third point. This week and next week, I'm going to look in more detail at these two framings of life. Primarily this one by rationality alone. I have written something on this. It was the Hill Lecture of 2006 for the Center for Cultural Renewal in Ottawa, if you want to know more about that. And that's what came up. Some of you asked me after the lecture about my view of the new Christendom. It relates to this, but I can't deal with that in these lectures. First of all, because I said I'd do 4, but they said they'd only pay me for 3, and I'm not doing nothing for nothing. I'm retired. I'm on a fixed income, okay? So we're going to look at these first two. Now, what I was arguing there was, and I want to just sort of briefly make a comment on this, that when we look at people like Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens, particularly Dawkins, when we look at the battle of the new atheism today, what we really have is not an atheism, it seems to me, as I suggested last week, but basically an attack on Christianity. And my argument was that these old atheisms arise because what Christianity does is accept the shift to a disenchanted world and tries to explain itself in natural, rational terms alone, and jams faith up above the clouds and the church up above the clouds, and basically puts it outside of here and then tries to explain it down here, but leaves the clouds there. I suggested last week that a new God arises out of this, a deist God, a God who's a Unitarian first mover. And when Christianity tries to make use of this, what it does is it produces the atheisms themselves. If you look, for example, at Dawkins, he can't exist without the 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee. He just can't exist without some people saying, I don't believe in evolution. Effectively, that's what he is. Effectively, it's what Hitchens is too, in a way. What they say is, I don't agree with you Christians. Now, this is not what I call atheism. It's what I call the old atheisms, and they're basically based on an attack on a God that isn't even the Christian God, and on dogmas that aren't even Christian. As a result of this, I would argue, and this I did not say last week, but I will say it now this week, so we're getting somewhere at least, that these old atheisms are really not atheisms at all, but new forms of religious imperialisms. The imperialism of reason is one of them. We can see how that manifests itself again and again. The imperialism of private judgment. And finally, the imperialism, what I would say, of the West, with our notion of human rights, liberal progressive values, freedom, democracy, and then less significant things, transparency, the market reality, consumer confidence, and all that sort of thing. A lot of this goes together. So we really are facing these imperialisms, and I'm suggesting that this imperialism of the West actually arises from this turn to ordinary life and the division of church and state that went on here. But since I'm not lecturing about that, I don't have to defend it. I can just put out my statement now and then walk out, right? At any rate, that's what I tried to do last week. Now, this week what I'd like to do is move to the question of faith and reason. And to move to the question of faith and reason, I'd like to look at this picture for a moment. If you are lucky enough to get into that room in the Vatican called the Segnatura, and you're able to see that picture of the Eucharist that I showed first with the division with the clouds there, if you look directly across from that picture, you will see another picture. And that picture is the School of Athens, also painted by Raphael, roughly the same time. This is what is, I should really have given you the whole picture of the School of Athens, but this is the picture that is there in the center. In other words, it's the central focus that sits over against the central focus of the Eucharist across the room, if you get into that place. If you don't get into that place, what you can go is to the Vatican website and call it up, and it'll give you pictures of this. You can even walk around in there. At any rate, this is the central one. And these two figures are Plato and Aristotle. Now, for Raphael, they depict faith and reason. Faith looks up and points upward. Aristotle, reason, points outward. Points outward to us and points outward to the earth. Each of them carry books in their hands. We can't quite see it on here, but Plato's is the Timaeus, interestingly enough, which is his telling of the story of how the world came into being. And Socrates, this is Aristotle, folks. I'm retired. I'm getting old, all right? Aristotle is carrying a book called Ethics. We're going to come back to that at a number of points tonight. Let's just remember that. Okay, we're going to look at the faith-reason division. That earlier Raphael picture, the problem was that faith got jammed up above the clouds, reason was left down here below, and never the twain shall meet. And Christians are in a problem. Because if we're trying to explain Christian faith in terms of what's beneath the clouds, we can't. All we can do is point one finger up, and the guy looks up and he sees clouds, and he says, I'm not interested in this at all. How do we put reason and faith together? Well, what I want to do is move to the next point on my little talk here. That is, what is the really old agnosticism? Now, I'm suggesting that what Christians have to face today is not the new atheism. In other words, Dawkins, Hitchens, Pierre Burton. What was the guy who was on the television show with Pierre Burton years ago? Gordon Sinclair, right? Gordon Sinclair atheism is the old atheism. It's just not worth thinking about. Forget it. Walk away from it. If somebody tries to argue on that basis, like they call you, Herb, will you come in and talk to a humanist who's going to talk about and defend the question whether or not God exists? I say, well, the question doesn't interest me. It doesn't interest me. Someone once said that. Well, we can get like 500 people in there. We get 500 bums in the room. We can charge them to come. We'll get you to defend God's existence, and we'll get an atheist to defend God's non-existence, and we'll charge them all $10, and it'll be great. Well, I said, no, I won't come unless you say, because I'm not interested whether God exists or not. Well, what are you interested in? I'm interested in the presence of God. Suddenly the question changes. The argument over the existence of God is always focused on this world. And, in fact, not talking about the nature of existence as I understand it at all. So it doesn't become an argument. So that old atheism doesn't interest me. What interests me is a new atheism. An atheism you start to see reflecting itself, it's probably earlier than this, but you start to see reflecting itself in this man, an American writer for whom I have a lot of respect. Do any of you know him, by the way? Exactly, Edgar Allan Poe. You know why I like him, because he began the murder mystery. And Edgar Allan Poe, in his wonderful Fall of the House of Usher, which doesn't come out on the sheet properly, so I'm going to have to read it from my own notes here, said, "It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fantasies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while beyond doubt there are combinations of very simple objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth." Now what Poe does, and Poe does this, by the way, that's in his House of the Fall of Usher. If you read his Purloined Letter, you find the protagonist in there making similar comments over and over again. What Poe is doing is leading us into the realm of mystery. Does he believe in a God? No. But what he recognizes is that if you were truly and really a rational person, you inevitably face the limits of rationality. And the question you ask is, what's beyond reason itself? This man, another American, a poet, Robert Frost, is a similar figure. I have to press it 14 times here, I know. There we are. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet, and far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Frost is a man who recognizes the night. You cannot scare me with your empty spaces between star on star where no human face is. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own empty spaces. What happens when reason comes to an end? These are the really old agnostics or the really new atheists. What happens when we look out in a world that we've had to look out onto this week, which we are so well reminded of tonight? How do we explain ourselves? There is no reason. It is beyond what we are capable of explaining. By the way, just while I mention that, I might just also mention that David Bentley Hart, the person a book I recommended to you last week, has also written a book called After the Tsunami. I think that's the title, is it not, Scott? And he also has a collection of essays in which he looks at this question, which at this week I think I would recommend Christians pick up. At any rate, what I'm looking at now are people who recognize there aren't pat, easy answers for everything. There aren't things that we can simply rationally explain, and if you can't explain it by reason, well, faith will tell you what. This is the new atheism that's really the new atheism, and it has a great similarity to some Christians. Now, the Christians it has a similarity to. This is the new atheist. This is the new agnostic. This is the experience of that person. But the difficulty with Christianity, the Locke Christianity or the Francis Bacon or the deist Christianity I looked at last week, on the one hand, or Pascal's Christianity on the other, doesn't join units with this person. It says it just looks like a mist out there. I can really explain that for you. Those aren't really clouds and mist. Let me tell you what's really up there. Now, the Christian in the 19th century who recognized this problem and tried to come to grips with it. Sorry, before I do that, let me show you some other Christians here. Any of you know who this person is? I doubt it very much. Even after I tell you, some people won't know it. They're very good friends, actually. They're not married. No, they're just very, very good friends. They both live in Oxford. The reason they're looking at each other this way and so much is because this man is tragically deaf. He can read lips. He's a remarkable person. He writes murder mysteries. I don't know if any of you have come across his murder mysteries. Any of you know this person? Inspector Morse, right? It's Inspector Morse. It's Colin Dexter who wrote the Inspector Morse stories. And Colin Dexter, who wrote the Inspector Morse stories, is one of these new atheists. He's one of these new atheists. In fact, if you read his last murder mystery, the very last one that he wrote, called The Remorseful Day, you'll see his hero, who's an atheist. And the book is packed full of Christian images. Now, he's a very, very good friend of the woman sitting on the other side, who's a particular heroine of mine, who created this person. That's P.D. James. P.D. James is interesting to me because she's a Christian, an Anglican Christian, who actually comes to grips with the new atheism. She doesn't try to sidestep the questions. She faces them dead on. She tries to speak as a Christian to people who are struggling. She's offended by this man, Thomas Huxley, in the 19th century, who invented the word agnosticism. There's another picture of Thomas Huxley. He thought he had everything together, you see. He couldn't even, but he didn't. He also thought that alas, poor Yorick was a stupid statement because it didn't make any sense, although here he's demonstrating it. And notice that he has his arms on top of books. The books aren't open, they're shut. The person I like is a person who lived at the same time, John Henry Newman. And I think the reason I'm throwing Newman up here is for several reasons. But the first reason is that it seems to me that he's one of the first theologians. Well, I don't know if you can call him a theologian. The first Christian thinkers in the 19th century who tries to come to grips with the new atheism, as I now mean the term. He tries to be, before his time, the example of a P.D. James talking to a Colin Dexter. He recognizes that the man standing out there in David Caspar Friedrich's picture where he looks out in the mists is all of us. Now, Newman is a terribly important figure, as I mentioned last week, not so much because he's read in universities, and not so much because simply we're going to have the Philharmonic concert this Saturday night is going to have presenting his dream of Gerontius in Edgar's musical setting, which you should all go to, by the way, and they tell me there's still tickets left, and if you're a student, you can get them for $10. But they're selling fast, different than last week. They weren't selling at all. But anyway, this week they're selling fast. So you got to get down there and get them fast. At any rate, Newman is important for me because I do see him, regardless of what some people say, as a precursor of Vatican II. Now, Vatican II, I want to make a few comments on and then move on. Vatican II has a lot of confusions about it. And one of the confusions about it is that with Vatican II, and I did not have anything to drink other than orange juice for supper. With Vatican II, the parlance goes, the church changed. It changed from where it was for the previous 1959 years. And suddenly there was a new church. Certainly, Vatican II brought enormous changes into the church. No question of that. But they weren't the most significant changes that a council has ever brought into the church. If you want to see a really significant change, go back to the late 1100s and wait until 1215 at a council called Lateran IV, and then the church changed. You didn't know what was there before. You would never understand it. It was a radical change. I even think there was a more radical change that occurred, or rather was marked by, Vatican I in 1870 than was marked by Vatican II in the 1960s. So, did things change? Yes. Was it such a dramatic change as we sometimes make it out? No. Secondly, and my second point is, that Vatican II does mark what I'm going to call the new church. And I'm only going to take one example tonight of why I see it as doing the new church. But before I do that, I want to emphasize one thing. Vatican II did not come out of nowhere. We know Pius XII was already planning a council. He would have never pulled it off, I don't think, but he at least had it in his mind. Now, the point simply I'm trying to make is that what happened, that Vatican II didn't come out of nowhere. From at least the 1890s and certainly from the 1920s, there had been all kinds of movements in biblical studies, liturgical studies, systematic theology, many, many orientations towards the modern world, which were developing frameworks which were leading toward what would become Vatican II. One of the men, for example, that I've worked on, Johann Adam Müller, from Tübingen School in the early 1800s, had already a number of suggestions about liturgy and various other things that were there already at that time that people took up seriously. Now, I only want to look at one thing that people took up seriously, and that was the question of atheism. Atheism was on the lips of a great number of thinkers in the Catholic Church. The atheism that I'm talking about, the really old agnosticism or the really new atheism, call it what you want. But the way in which I have framed it for you was on the lips of people since at least the 1920s. In the 1930s, the great Dominican Yves Congar wrote an article on this. And then, in the late 1940s, Henri de Lubac came out with this book called The Drama of Atheist Humanism. It wasn't out of nowhere. There were many other people who were writing about it and many other people that would write about it afterwards. In the early 1950s, Joseph Ratzinger wrote a remarkable article on this question, atheist humanism, as did Karl Rahner. People were writing on it all the time, and just before Vatican II, one of the most magnificent books came out on the subject by a remarkable Italian scholar, Cornelio Fabro, called God in Exile, Modern Atheism. And there you are. Now, this is before Vatican II, this is written. Well, it sort of comes out. It's published during the time. But it's being taken very seriously. And this book influences the Pope at the time, Paul VI, when Paul VI comes to power. And in 1965, Paul VI develops a secretariat for non-believers. And that secretariat is what eventually comes to develop the schema, which will be Gaudium et Spes in the Vatican II documents, which paragraphs 19 and following treat modern atheism. And they treat modern atheism, the atheism I'm talking about, in a radically different way than atheism had been treated before. They take it seriously. And they recognize that people like Poe and people like Frost, there's only two examples, and people like Colin Dexter, are not simply antagonists to Christianity who are sort of so stupid they simply they say, well, you believe that, the snakes had feet before God told them to go on their bellies. They don't fall into that kind of a category. They're thoughtful, reflective human beings, and they must be treated as thoughtful, reflective human beings. Now, in this way, this Vatican II document, I'm only taking one of these themes now in it, is picking up all the themes I've been getting at earlier last week and this week. And what they turn back to again and again, particularly the individuals who look seriously at this, are the works of John Henry Newman. And needless to say, the present Pope in particular is deeply influenced by him. Now, that's how I understand the new church. I understand the new church, the post-Vatican II church, as a church which is not rejecting, of course, what I call Baroque Catholicism, went before, but is recognizing that there's a new vision to be dealt with, and that we must be very, very careful how we deal with our apologetic, how we explain the Christian faith to others, or we'll end up in the same problems as John Locke and Blaise Pascal did. We'll end up by, once again, insisting on the divide between nature and supernature, and leaving ourselves down here below solely arguing on grounds on which we can't fully argue. Now, in this framework, how did Newman go at it? That's what I want to look at tonight. I better tell you right off the bat that I'm not a liberal. And neither was Newman. I'm, in fact, an antagonist to liberalism. I'm so anti-liberal, I've come right around the other side. Or is that I'm so ultra-right-wing, I'm right back on the left side? I'm not sure. But Newman did not like liberalism. But before we say, well, we have to understand what he meant by liberalism. I better treat this right off the bat, get it out of the way. Nobody understands me when I say I'm a conservative. They all immediately sort of make the sign of the cross and run out of the room, or something like that. I'm a conservative in the sense that Newman was a conservative. And what didn't he like about liberalism? Well, if we look at the Oh no, this isn't it. Good heavens. This is even a better statement by Newman, but we'll forget about it. This is the statement that indicates that he really was an atheist. Before I go on to it, I was so anxious to get to his anti-liberalism that I just skipped this slide. My point simply is that Newman himself, let me go back. Have I lost everyone by this point? Before we get to the anti-liberalism, we'll look at why Newman understood these atheists I'm talking about, the really new atheists. The reason he understood them was because he recognized that when you look out in the world, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And this is a man of faith speaking. I better get the right page here. I'm really in trouble. This is a man of faith speaking. And basically what he says is, I can read it up here, to consider the world in its length and breadth. When I consider the world in its length and breadth, by the way, if you want to find this, it's in his Apologia, his little book on his apology for his life. When I think of the many races of man, their starts, their fortunes, their multitudes of alienation, their conflicts and their ways, habits, forms of worship, their enterprises, their aimless courses, the random achievements and acquirements, impotent conclusions of long-standing facts. When we look out in the world, think of how many things have gone awry just in the last 50 years. The progress of things as if from unreasoning elements not towards final causes, the greatness and the littleness of man, his far-reaching aims, his short duration, the curtain that is hung over his futurity, the disappointments of life, the success of evil, physical pain, mental anguish, prevalence and intensity of sin, pervading idolatries, corruptions, hopeless irreligion, the condition of the whole race so fearfully and exactly described in the apostles' words, having no hope and without God in the world. All this is but to dizzy and appall and inflicts upon the mind the sense of a profound mystery which is absolutely beyond human reason. I understand you, Robert Frost. I understand you, Edgar Allan Poe. I understand you, Mr. Atheist, let's say, when you say this doesn't make sense to me. Look at the world as it really is. This is Newman. This is Newman. He's at the beginning of trying to deal with this question. And that's why he came to the conclusion that there was no medium in true philosophy between... I came to the conclusion there was no medium in true philosophy between atheism and Catholicity. And that a perfectly consistent mind, under those circumstances in which it finds itself here below, must embrace either the one or the other. In other words, when you look at the world, said Newman, exactly as it is and don't pull your punches, you have only two choices: atheism or Catholicity. Now, the question of Catholicity came up last week, and it sounded to some of you as though I was suggesting that only Catholic Christians counted. I am. Boy, that should set the audience back for a while, shouldn't it? In other words, what Newman, by the way, Newman said this when he was an Anglican, so be careful. What Newman meant was that the choice is between atheism, if you look at the world in a realistic way, or Catholic Christianity. That is the Christianity of those human beings who accept by faith the basic principles of the Nicene and Apostles' Creed. Who can stand up and say, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins. Now that includes many, many Protestants as well. What Newman didn't think was an option was liberal Christianity. He opposed liberal Christianity for a number of reasons. I think I'm at the right slide now. When he was given the cardinalate in 1879, he said that he has opposed from the beginning of his life liberalism. Now, why was he opposed to liberalism? Well, he was opposed to it because he thought it was non-Catholic. And we're going to use small c Catholic now, so we don't get mixed up with Roman Catholic. Think of Catholicity the way I've just described it, okay? Catholic Christians are those Christians who can, in worship, pray the Apostles' Creed. There will be differences between us, believe me, but those differences we're not talking about here this evening, even though, in fact, Monday is a very important day to start thinking about those differences. I'm just curious, how many people know why? Yeah, the week of prayer for Christian unity begins Monday. Now, that is a different question. That's a question I'm not talking about, okay? But what I'm talking about now is a distinction between Catholic Christianity and liberal Christianity in Newman's mind. Newman thought that the difficulty was that liberal Christianity led to the old atheisms, and that it didn't take reality seriously enough. Liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, that one creed is as good as another, and that this is the teaching which is gaining substance and force daily. It teaches that all are to be tolerated for all matters of opinion. Religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous, and it is the right of each individual to say just what strikes his or her fancy. Sounds like a modern religious studies department. They're not paying my salary anymore. I can say what I want, right? The argument here is not against tolerance or anything like that. What Newman is concerned about with this kind of liberalism is that it's imperialistic. The moment I say all religions are the same, and mine is just down there with the rest of yours, let's talk about it, I have taken a superior liberal stance to all of them. I am now standing above all, making judgments. But I'm not judging myself. Do you see Newman's point? This is Newman's point. And he felt that this kind of Christianity was lost. It was gone. It would lead to nothingness. It would fall apart. The choice then for consistent minds is atheism or Catholicity. Now, we might get to Catholicity tonight, but I doubt it. But we'll get there next week, so don't worry about it. The point I want to make next is, how did Newman carry this out? Well, he carried it out by rejecting an apologetic of reason. In other words, he rejected the notion that the way in which a Christian proclaims the faith, and remember that a Christian proclaiming the faith is doing theology. And theology has three purposes: to offer faith where there is no faith, to strengthen faith where faith is weak, and to give joy to faith where faith is strong. It's to offer faith where there is no faith. And that same word of proclamation can give strength to faith where faith is weak, for those people with faith who have doubts, and can give joy to faith for those who don't have doubts on that particular topic and just say, wow, wasn't that cool? Now that's the work of theology. It's the work of Christian apologetics. But that apologetics, that's the Christian task, to do theology. Now, if we do that, however, what Newman believed was we can't do it solely on a rational basis. It doesn't work if you call a bunch of people into a room and have an argument over, does God exist? It only works when people deal with this as cor ad cor loquitur. Now, as those Catholics in the room know, God speaks Latin. He always has, he always will. So my Protestant friends in the room who do not know Latin, It's all right. Scott and I will be there at the pearly gates helping you translate to get in, okay? The cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. This is Newman's point. Newman rejects a rationalistic theology and replaces it with a rhetorical theology. Now, this is the main point of my speech tonight. And since I'm at 8:23 and have only 7 minutes left, I better make the point. Newman has moved to an older form of Christian theology, to patristic theology. In this way, he's very, very much like and therefore, and also very much liked by a favorite theologian of mine, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Henri de Lubac. Now, what is patristic Christianity? Well, for the moment, let's make it very simple and say patristic Christianity includes all those people who wrote about Christianity and lived Christianity from, I'm really going to narrow it down, 325 to 451, from the Council of Nicaea to the Council of Chalcedon. During that 125 years, that's the golden age of Christianity, every single basic traditional Christian doctrine that we have today came into being at that time. Protestant and Catholic, by the way. All the major things, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the notion of original sin, even the concept of what's involved in what books are in the Scriptures, give or take a few, come into being at this time. This is classical Christianity. And Newman goes back to and all the great theologians of the Christian church lived at that time. In fact, most Christianity after 451 is just a burp, right? Now you can see why I don't read anything after Gutenberg. It's just a burp on the scene. Or it's wrong. But, is that prejudiced or not? The point I want to make, however, is very important. The great theologians lived during that time. In the West, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose. In the East, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, John Chrysostom. All the great theologians who created the Christian theology that we have today and out of which we live and move. All those men lived at that time. Macrina, women too, the sister of the Basil. But none of them were trained as philosophers. They were all trained as rhetoricians. In fact, almost every Christian theologian up to roughly the 13th century was trained as a rhetorician, not a philosopher. Now, what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is what we once did, but no longer do, in English departments. English departments have now come sort of third-rate sociologists and fifth-rate philosophers, but, sorry, Norm. Well, not here at St. Jerome's. I know the chair of the department, and we're okay. Right. But this isn't going on a podcast, is it? Oh. You can cut this out? It may not. Okay. At any rate, the point is that they're rhetoricians. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and it fits pretty much what we mean by literary criticism, or what we used to mean by literary criticism. Philosophy is a different thing, and particularly by the post-Raphael section, where you start getting a very strict kind of scholasticism, not medieval scholasticism, but early modern scholasticism, where everything works on the basis of reason. Rhetoric is different. Rhetoric is concerned with heart speaking to heart. And there's a small passage, not a small passage, it's a huge passage. This comes from Aristotle. Now, before I go on, I want to say one other thing. Aristotle is a problem, for Catholics in particular, because Catholics get him wrong. Since about the time of the 1600s, the Reformation era, Catholics have inevitably looked at Aristotle, but only looked at his logical works, his physical works, his rational works, his prior analytics, the logic. We reduced in the 16th and 17th century Aristotle to a logician, a rational, a cut-and-dried, systematic character. The interesting thing is that at Oxford in the 19th century, Aristotle was on the students' curriculum. Everybody had to read Aristotle. But guess what? The Aristotle that was on Newman's curriculum, which he grew up with, was the Aristotle of the poetics, the politics, the ethics. Do you see what I'm getting at? The rhetoric. They understood a different Aristotle. And one of the reasons I am so excited about Newman being beatified is because Newman brought to us as Catholics the great Anglican insight into Aristotle the rhetorician, which Newman thought was the Aristotle and the way of going at explaining and proclaiming Christianity today. Now, what did Aristotle say? Well, Aristotle, first of all, said the common thing, that in the ancient world, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And how do you persuade people? Well, the John Locke's thought the way you persuaded people was to give them an airtight argument. And the John Locke's, in fact, thought that what you could do, pretty much thought this, I'm being a little unjust to John Locke, that you go to somebody like Thomas Aquinas, five ways for proving the existence of God, lay out the 5 ways, and then say, okay, do you believe in God now? And if somebody says no, you have 2 choices. You can say, well, then you're stupid, right? Or you're just willfully obstinate. And if you like the guy, you would say, you're invincibly ignorant. You know? You're stuck with that. No. Newman says, mind does not speak to mind, heart speaks to heart. And he got this from Aristotle. What did Aristotle say? He simply said that the power of persuasion depends on a person's character. That the character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion a person possesses. Aristotle called this ethos. Notice the relation of ethos to ethics. Heart speaks to heart, not mind to mind. Secondly, that persuasion may come through the hearers, may come through hearers. The speech stirs their emotions. This is known as pathos. But I want to make a more important point here that Newman makes. And that is the second aspect of rhetoric is hearing. Now, for Newman and for Christians, this is extremely important. Sight is a problem. When I argue with you logically, I say, do you see this? Seeing is a terrible problem. Because by sight, we think we control things. See, I see you. Right? I'm in control of my sight. But I'm not in control of my hearing. It can come from behind me. It can come from out there. It can come from somewhere else. I don't have any control over what I hear. Hearing is that preeminent human characteristic that links human beings together as human beings. Because when we hear, we recognize that we are not our own, that it's coming from somewhere else. I see Scott. I see Scott. And I'm in control of what I see now. I can look this way. I don't want to see it. But if he speaks, I have no control over that. Hearing is the first opening to grace. That's why I feel really out of place showing these damned, literally, slides. Because I'm training you to become people of sight, right? And it's why sometimes I kind of wonder at Mass why we have this practice of following the book as the word is proclaimed. We've lost the ability to hear in our society. In fact, we've really lost the ability to hear because we now put plugs in our ears where we listen to what we want to listen to. Is this part of why, in the society in which we live in today, to talk about grace, it's becoming more and more difficult to talk about grace? Because we've lost the sense of hearing. And hearing also opens up for Newman the idea of puzzlement. Question: where did the voice come from? What did I hear? Reading doesn't do that. You take a big book like Fabreau's book on atheism, and I read it, right? I read it through. I know what it's about. If I don't get it, I can flip back and figure it out. I stand about. I see the pages. I'm not listening to Fabreau. I'm telling him what he's saying. I'm reducing him to my sight. Now, this becomes a difficulty in our age then. And what Newman felt was that, so hearing is the second thing. The third thing, however, is not gone. Reason is not gone. There is still logos. And with this I want to close for this evening. Logos is the last aspect of rhetoric for Newman and for Aristotle. Logos is a most important word because for Newman it meant, obviously, it is the logos, the word of God. How does God reveal the fullness of divine love to human beings? By God's word. God speaks. Christ is called at the beginning of John the Logos, the Word. Now that word has rational content, but it is heard. You can't reason hearing. You can only turn in faith or turn away in faith. If someone calls Peter, I turn. Might be looking at some other Peter. So the Logos is terribly important here. Now, the last point I want to make, however, I'll reduce to a simple example, which one or two of you in the room have seen 1,000 times before and have said, Herb, can't you get some new examples? No, I'm not that bright. The example is this. Newman is going one step further. I'm switching the topic just a bit, or the shift just a bit. Just a minute. Let me see if there's something else on here. No, I'll do that next week. I'll do that next week. I'll ignore that. Oh. Let's get back to that and look at Newman while I explain this. The point is simply this. Heart speaks to heart. Cor ad cor loquitur. That's Newman's motto. That means that the speaker must have a good character. Quintilian, the great Roman orator, said, "Let no man say he is a good orator unless he is a good man." You don't study rhetoric aside from ethics. In Newman's classroom, he studied them together. Now, the second thing about rhetoric is that it operates on the basis of hearing. It's not empty faces collecting other faces around them and calling it a social network. Oh, did I just attack something? It is actually human hearts and human hearts. And so it is pathos. Hearing is the voice of one coming to the other and the other understanding, or at least reacting to it. And then in that hearing, there is sense. It makes sense to me. Now, the big difficulty for Newman was, in his day, faith and reason appeared to be opposites. At the beginning of next week, I want to look at how, for Newman, faith and reason were not opposites. Faith was actually a form of reason for him. You could not pull the two apart. Raphael's cloud was dispersed. It wasn't going back to an old Giotto rain again. He was trying to develop a new rain. And it went like this. Newman would say, and this is my example, not Newman's, but it's roughly the sort of thing he would say. Dare I sit in the chair? If I'm going to ask that question as a rational human being, what do I have to do before I sit in the chair? I have to make certain it won't collapse. So I test it. And it doesn't collapse. I can sit in it. No, I can't. Because if I am truly rational, truly reasonable, I could have just bent the leg while I was doing that. Right? Now, we have to be truly rational, fully rational, and live only on the basis of reason. Now, you can say, well, how do I know I didn't bend the chair? So I can carry it over to a lab over here and have it x-rayed to see there isn't a flaw in it. But how do I know the x-ray didn't cause a flaw? To be fully and completely rational, I will end up catatonic. I can't live. And here came Newman's next big step. He said, human life is practice. You mean it's lived, right? You live. Human beings live. You cannot live by reason alone. You can only live by faith. Everyone. By faith are you saved. Through grace. Not of yourselves. That's the point. The just person lives by faith. Now, Newman puts the emphasis on live. The point is, how are we to live? The only way we can live is by faith. So what do? I'm tired. I sit in the chair. The moment I let myself go, that's an act of faith. At that point, I assent, said Newman, to all kinds of inferences. Now, this is his point about assent and inference. Faith is an assent. And it's an assent in certitude. The certitude is in me that if I sit, the chair won't collapse. I'm certain of that. Certitude. I have that certitude. But when I sit in the chair, it is an assent which is ultimately an act of faith, but it is not irrational. You people who were here last week are irrational. You knew I would go on for over an hour. You knew these chairs were terrible, and you still came. The point you see is that faith is not irrational. Faith is a form of reason. It is an assent to inferences. But without the assent to inferences, without the act of faith, no human being can live. That's it for tonight.
Thank you, Peter. Peter has agreed to take a few questions. We have about 15, 20 minutes to do this. If you would like to ask a question, please make your way to either side of the room. We have 2 microphones set up there. Please keep your questions, and keep them short, because Peter, he'll try to keep his short as well to get as many questions as we can in. So please make your way to the microphones. Yes.
Good evening. I wonder if you could explain something to me. Perhaps I misunderstood you. I can see how faith and reason are perhaps a range, and you have to sort of find a balance between the two to live your life on a daily basis. I understand that, but I think you belittle the idea that ultimately ration is what makes life practical. For example, if we take Joseph Ratzinger, I forget it's Pope Benedict X, I believe he is now. telling sub-Saharan Africans not to wear condoms. Well, I understand that he probably meant well. I understand that he probably believed what he was saying. But we know for a fact that that's poor advice. We know that it's not true that that will actually help the problem. We know that it's a fact that it will probably cause more humans to suffer, actually. And I'm concerned about that what I consider ambiguous understanding between faith and reason, because I think where reason is ignored, human suffering occurs.
That's a good question. And, boy, you want me to do that in 140? Do I have a funny 140 characters for that? Yeah. I would, without getting into the particular aspects of the question, I would say that where I would disagree with you would be on 2 points. And where I think Benedict would disagree with you would be on 1 point in particular. And that is in the certainty expressed in your statement that we know this is the case.
Okay.
We know that if this happened, that would happen. Newman's point is, and by the way, I think Ratzinger's point is as well, that reason is limited. We do not know. We never are certain. We can never, within a certain framework, we can make judgments. But there are many, many frameworks in human life which extend beyond the framework of rationality, on which we do not know the answers. Now, this is why I have to give a talk actually next week on Monday night, and I've called that Newman's scholarly humility. What Newman's argument is that in the great number of human experiences, we think we know what the result will be, but if you look at it, but we do not know what the result will be, because there are too many other additional questions that can come to bear into that. Now, for example, if you take the question of Benedict's question of condoms and leaving aside the way in which Catholicism manages to get itself in sound bites, and look at the question some other way, we don't know. I would argue, and I think probably Benedict would argue, that we don't know that the transference of millions of condoms to Africa will solve the AIDS problem.
Well, I don't expect it'll solve it. I believe it'll minimize the spread, though, which will reduce human suffering.
But the question is, rationally, we have to make a judgment. Now, for Newman, that judgment, in fact, it was something I didn't have in the talk tonight, which I hope will be in the final papers, that judgment is always a probable judgment. In fact, give me just a second, if you wouldn't mind. Let me just do something here to come to the question. I know this sounds stupid, but there's a picture of a man. That man's name is, boy, that's a brilliant statement. That man's name is Joseph Butler. Next to Aristotle, he was Newman's favorite philosopher. He was, in fact, the favorite philosopher of the 19th century. Now, what people like Newman and Butler was actually an 18th century figure, what people like Newman and Butler were arguing was, and I realize I'm not getting directly to answering your question, but I want to get to the principle that's behind it, that Newman is trying to get at, and that, in fact, Benedict's trying to get at. In both John Paul II and in Benedict, we find extensive discussion about the nature of reason. So, for example, one of the most marvelous books I think that are written in the late 20th century is this little book called Faith and Reason by John Paul II. And there are numerous lengthy discussions by Benedict on the question of reason. One of them, in fact, is by, and I'm coming back to the question, sir, please don't.
That's fine.
One of them is by this discussion that, as Ratzinger, he had with the atheist Marxist Jürgen Habermas in 2004, called The Dialectics of Secularization on Reason and Religion, in which both Habermas and Ratzinger actually come together on the principle that I'm going to lay forward in a moment. The other thing in Benedict's case, another book, sadly, this is not yet translated. I don't know why it hasn't been. It was done in Italian, and my Italian is terrible, so I had to read it in German. It's Joseph Ratzinger and Paolo Floris d'Arques. Is There a God? It's in German now. I hope it comes out in English soon. Benedict has also carried on a long series of conversations with an Italian journalist on this subject, in which the question, for instance, sexuality questions come up as well. Now, I'm just saying that for a moment because I do think that that Benedict Ratzinger is very, very often misinterpreted. But I want to get back to the point. The point that I want to get back to is that if you look at both the atheist Jürgen Habermas and Ratzinger in here, both of them recognize the limitations of reason. And the limitations are that reason always works according to the pattern that Newman knew so well, that Joseph Butler put forward. Reason always works on the principle that probability is a guide to life. That in real life experiences, political, social, and human experiences generally, we are caught with probable reasons, never with final reasons. So Newman would have said, on the particular topic you bring forward to us, that's a legitimate question to raise. Let's talk about it. Let's look at all the probabilities that are involved here in carrying on this way and that, including the large number of Muslims in Africa who would have serious questions about the West handing out condoms. Let's look at all these things before we make a final decision, so that the probabilities are greater than the rational ones, so the liberal belief in ultimate reason has to go as the final authority. Does that kind of help the theory behind it?
Perhaps. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I guess we're at a stalemate.
Yeah, probably
Thank
are.
you.
But that's why hearts speak to hearts and minds don't speak to minds. Yeah.
Thank you.
If you could you touched on Vatican II with respect to atheism. I'm wondering if you could actually just, for those of us who are less informed with respect to Catholic doctrine, could you describe exactly how Vatican II addressed atheism? Are you talking about Lumen Gentium or the?
Yeah, there's one phrase in Lumen Gentium that comes up. Let me think. Let me sort of sum it up in 140 characters. I think I got 140 characters here somewhere. The big section on Lumen, what happened was in 1965, Paul VI opened the Secretariat for Non-Believers. And that Secretariat would develop that into another council, but we won't worry about that. And it led towards the development of Gaudium et Spes. In Gaudium et Spes, it's paragraphs 19 and following are the big ones. But let me just read you one simple statement here on that, which might help you. It's a paragraph from Gaudium et Spes. This might help to get to your question. A little more than 140 characters. Undeniably, those who willfully shut out God from their hearts and try to dodge religious questions are not following the dictates of their consciences and hence are not free of blame. Yet believers themselves frequently bear some responsibility for the situation. For taken as a whole, atheism is not a spontaneous development that stems from a variety of causes, including a critical reaction against religious beliefs, and in some places against the Christian religion in particular. In other words, Vatican II is... I simply was repeating Vatican II all last week. Yeah. I signed a paper today that said this wasn't plagiarized. Well, it's all come from Newman and Vatican II, right? Hence, believers can have more than a little to do with the birth of atheism, as I tried to suggest last week. To the extent that they neglect their own training in the faith and teach erroneous doctrine, like that God is a first cause and not a trinity, or that Jesus was just a nice man who walked the earth, or are deficient in their religious, moral, and social life, character, they must be said to conceal rather than reveal the authentic face of God and religion. Now, there's an awful lot packed into that, and one of the things that's packed into that is the question of the face of God. And this was before, I happen to know you, so I know you'll know, for those people in here who want to sort of keep up with their English departments, this is before Levinas, right? It's even before Facebook. But the question of the face of God is that the Vatican II was already moving towards that principle that as human beings, we must be careful of assigning attributes to God. All we can assign are names. If we name God omnipotent, all-loving, that's one thing. Those are our names, like Adam named the animals in the forest, right? But if we start making attributes, therefore God is omnipotent and all-loving, how do we deal with this week? See, it's a different program we're looking at here. A much different program. Are we a long way from expanding the program among Christians at large? Sure. We always have been. Are we a long way to understanding it ourselves? Sure. Did I answer the person that asked a very civil and intelligent question as fully as I could? No. We're human beings. And this is the world we live in. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Since we have a bit more time, Peter, I want to ask you a question, actually, and I think it gets to a thorny question that the Vatican has been wrestling with in some cases in the media. At one point, you made the argument using Newman that we have a choice between atheism on the one hand and Catholicity on the other. And Catholicity you defined as we can pray the creeds. What about religions such as Islam that understand the clouds, the sort of the nebulous? Where does that kind of interreligious problem, so to speak, come into play?
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk about that, Scott. But I would talk about that within a different framework. When I'm talking about the question of Catholicity, I'm talking about the question as an intra-Christian question. This is not a question that has anything to do with, I'm going to pick for the moment Islam or Hinduism. But within this question, the point I want to get at is that, let me do it this way. Let me go back at Newman's liberalism statement. What Newman was opposed to in liberalism was the suggestion that somehow we can stand above and make a judgment. We are only who we are. I am a Catholic Christian. I believe that the Word of God, which was there in the beginning that created the universe, spoke in these latter times through His Word, and that the fullest manifestation of that Word subsists in the Catholic Church. Now, if I go to someone and say to them, I'm going to talk to you now as if I'm not that. What I am is I'm pretending I'm something I'm not. In other words, what Newman is getting at is we are, this is the way I would look at this question. The question is that if one tries to stand outside of one's own particularity, being proud of that particularity, because we've been graced with it. But if one tries to stand outside of it and above it, one is both rejecting the divine creation that one says one is, and one is also pretending something to another person. I mean, I remember, I'll give you this sort of personal experience of this. In the middle of the 1960s, I took a job in Cleveland's Huff. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Cleveland's Huff. It's quite a marvelous place. It was the black ghetto in the early 1960s. I took a job there as a teacher in a school. And I walk into this school, which is 99% black kids from the Huff area. And it's run by an old football coach who was the principal. His name was Spez O'Farrell. And Spez was an old football coach, and he'd hired all his old football team to teach in the school, and people were starting to grumble about this, and he had to get an outsider, and that's how I got the job. And so I'm teaching English in this school. And Spez had one rule in that school. He said, Herb, if I hear a student calling you a Captain White, that's okay. Now, I don't know what the language of the streets is these days, but in those days, Captain White was the white guy who said to the guy in the slums, tote that bale, lift that bag, or whatever, right? If the students get that idea about you, you probably will stay on. I'll ream you out, and he reamed me out thousands of times, but anyway, not for that, but for other things. But he said, the one rule in this school is that if I ever hear, even in jest, one student calling you a Mr. Charlie, you're gone that day. What's a Mr. Charlie? A Mr. Charlie's a guy who sits down with a person in the slums, puts his arm around him and says, I understand your pain. Well, I don't understand their pain. Now, see the point I'm getting at? I have for instance, I had a student just a year ago who was a convinced Shiite Muslim. We got along marvelously. But he never once thought that I was anything but a committed Catholic Christian. Now, we got into terrible, terrible arguments. And one time in my office, we were yelling at one another. Cheerfully, that is. Yeah. But people were walking by the halls saying, oh my God, what's Herb done? You know, he set the department back 2,000 years. The point simply is we can't leave aside our particularity. And that's what Newman meant by liberalism. The suggestion that the person who says our minds work like computers refuses to face the fact that the person who says that our minds work like computers is standing outside of the judgment that our minds work like computers. So in interreligious dialogue, and the question about interreligious dialogue we have to get out of our mind too is the notion that somehow or other we are making judgments. I mean, the only being that I know of who can make a judgment about hell is God. I think that's good Catholic doctrine, by the way. Yeah. We can say that Newman's in heaven, but we can't say anybody's in hell. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. It's another wonderful evening that you've provided for us, and I think one of the things that really sticks out to me is, among the many things that you've given us, is as Christians, as Catholics, as people who operate by faith and reason, that we need to learn how to argue well. That going to the rhetoricians, that we need to be able to engage each other in difference, and I think you've given us a good model of inviting us into a conversation that is a very positive argument. So thank you very much for that. As we wrap up, I just do want to remind you of some of the events that are going on around here. We have a number of lectures that are coming up on February 5th. Austin Clarke will be speaking at St. Jerome's University. As many of you know, Austin Clarke is a world-renowned author at this point. He'll be speaking here, I believe it's at 7 or 7:30. I'll announce this again next week. It's part of the Catholic Reads lecture series that is hosted here at St. Jerome's. Also in the foyer, there are a number of tables out there this evening. One table has a donations basket. It's all these lectures are provided free to you. If, however, you want to make a free will donation, please do. Just use the envelopes that are in your chairs, fill those out. Anything that you give us over $10 will be receipted, and we will very much appreciate that. There is also a table that sells fairly traded coffee. This is sponsored by the University Catholic community at St. Jerome's University. And this evening we have a new table sponsored by Beyond Borders. Beyond Borders is an international experiential learning program at St. Jerome's University that provides opportunities for our students to travel abroad and to work with people and to live with people who live on the margins of society to help us have a greater understanding of the world that is around us. So please stop in at their table, say hi to some of the students that are in this year's Beyond Borders program. It's an absolutely wonderful program. On your way out, there is a sign-up sheet if you would like to receive emails about upcoming lectures, including the Austin Clarke lecture that I just butchered tonight in terms of the time. please put your name on that. As I mentioned last week, we had a bit of a problem sort of transitioning some things at St. Jerome's, and we lost part of our mailing list. So if in the past you've received emails from us, but all of a sudden you stopped receiving emails, please go ahead and put your name on that list, and we'll be happy to make contact with you. Apropos of Peter's slamming of Facebook on a number of occasions tonight, the St. Jerome's Lectures in Catholic Experience now have a Facebook page. I didn't even tell him this was happening. This is a way of communicating heart to heart, if you will. We can do that via email or via Facebook. If you do have a Facebook account, please just type in St. Jerome's Lectures in Catholic Experience. It will pop right up. Just make us a fan. What you will get there are, again, announcements of things going on at St. Jerome's around the center. And there are quite a few things on the horizon. So if you're on Facebook, please take a look at that. I believe for showing up. We hope to see you again next week when Dr. Erb wraps up this series. So until then, have a very safe home, and God bless.